Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so today we are going to continue our look at the history of the Pokémon Trading Card Game, and we're going to be looking at the Diamond and Pearl Stormfront set. Now, I've done a few of these videos so far, taking you through the history of the Pokémon Trading Card Game, and I've been asking for suggestions of sets you'd like to see. And on YouTube, on Twitter, etc., the overwhelming choice has been Stormfront. So let's have a look at this one. Couple of things of context. I want to set the scene a little bit before we get going here. So 3 things I think you need to know. Number 1, evolving was, oh my goodness, so much easier back then. For 2 reasons. Firstly, we had Broken Time Space, and that was a card which allowed you to evolve into a stage 1, stage 2 whenever you liked. It was a stadium, you put it on the field, and you can just evolve whenever you feel like it, which meant you could get your evolutions out much, much quicker. Now, we also had Rare Candy, and back then Rare Candy was much better. Firstly, it was a card that allowed you to evolve into a stage 1 or a stage 2, but more importantly, it allowed you to evolve on the first turn of the game, and you could attack on the first turn of the game, which was pretty gosh darn big. Now, I should mention Broken Time Space didn't come out till Platinum, which was slightly after Stormfront, but these 2 cards together allowed you to get your evolution Pokemon out much quicker. It made evolutions far more viable. We also had 2 cards that meant that the decks around were far more consistent. People drew into what they wanted far more often, meaning that there was more skill in terms of you could make a slightly less consistent deck, so to speak, but because we had such consistent engines around the way in which you actually run your deck, that you could run, say, a 1-0-1 line, let's say, for instance, 1 Machop, 0 Machoke, 1 Machamp, and because you were already playing Rare Candy, this was actually a viable strategy. The kind that isn't nowadays. And this was for 2 reasons. Firstly, we had Uxie. Put him on your bench, and you can draw it until you got 7 cards in your hand. Kind of like Shaymin EX is nowadays, except you get an extra card and he doesn't sit on your bench and give up 2 prizes. We also had Claydol, who had a lovely little poker power, abilities it would be nowadays, and that allowed you to put 1 or 2 cards on the bottom of your deck and then draw until you had 6 cards in your hand. And let's not forget that we had Rare Candy and Broken Time Space that would allow you to get Claydol out much, much quicker. The other thing that needs to be borne in mind is that the SP cards, these were powerful basic cards like Luxray and Garchomp, had not yet taken over the format, but in a couple sets' time they would. So a couple cool cards that aren't going to make our top 10 for Stormfront. There was a reprint of the entire Charizard line from the original base set, but as kind of special shiny rare cards, which was kind of cool. There was also a Mamoswine in Stormfront, and though it was not particularly good, there was a Mamoswine card in Stormfront, and that, ladies and gentlemen, makes me very, very happy. So for the first 3 cards here, we're going to cheat a little bit. Stormfront was an exceptional set, and to be honest, the top 4 were all utterly, utterly stunning, and 5 through 7 are pretty gosh darn good. So from 8 till 10, we're lumping a whole bunch together. Please don't be mad at me for this. So at number 10, we have got a few random Pokemon. Some Pokemon which saw a little bit of play and were quite good. So let's run through some of these. We had Magnezone, and he saw a little bit of play. He had a really fun poker power ability, as it would now be. Super Connectivity. Search your discard for a lightning or metal energy, attach it to your active Pokemon, put 1 damage counter on that Pokemon. Now, we've since seen abilities very similar to this on cards like Electric and Bronzong, although both of them are to the bench, not to the active. It is extra energy attachment. And when we had Magnezone Prime come in, a card which seems to keep being mentioned in these history videos, when we get to Triumphant, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, Magnezone Prime will be getting a mention. It's going to make that list. And Magnezone Prime allowed you to do 50 damage times the number of energy cards put in the Lost Zone, attached to all of your Pokemon, so Stormfront Magnezone allowed you to get the damage out more quickly. Want another kind of cool Pokemon which deserves to be mentioned? How about Dusknoir from Stormfront? Now, Dusknoir from Stormfront had a fun little ability, Shadow Command. You could draw 2 cards. If you have 7 or more cards in your hand, discard cards until you got 6 in your hand, and then put 2 damage counters on Dusknoir. So you get to draw 2 cards, that's really good. You get to put cards in your discard pile, and we all know that there are decks around that like to play from the discard pile. You know, cards like VS Seeker, for instance, have always been around to make sure, not always, but often been around to make sure we can grab our supporters back, etc., etc. And it had a fun little attack. Well, a couple fun little attacks. Damage Even allowed you to put a number of damage counters on the defending Pokemon. On one of your opponent's Pokemon equal to the damage on Dusknoir. You've got 70 damage on you, you can KO an Uxie on the bench. Or maybe you can use that damage to KO a Claydol on the bench, for instance. And Claydol would sit on the bench and be very useful. And it had Night Spin, which allowed you to do 50 damage, but prevent all effects of attacks to any Pokemon that had 2 or less energy attached to it. And as we're going to see from a whole bunch of these Pokemon, most of the good ones from Stormfront, all the SP Pokemon, etc., had little energy. Now, this was never a game-breaking card, but it was a fun little card that saw a little bit of play. Speaking of which, let's have a look at Luminium. Now again, Luminium wasn't amazing, but it had a fun little ability, Fin Luster. I say ability, I of course mean Poké Power. And you got to just look at your opponent's hand, and if their bench isn't full, you get to take a Pokemon from their hand and put it onto their bench. It's a nice little disruption card. Let's say they've got something like an Uxie in their hand, for argument's sake. You put it on their bench, it takes up a bench space, they don't get to use the ability. I saw a few people playing Luminium. It was not a greatly played card, but as we're looking at just little cards which saw a little bit of play at number 10, let's give it a mention. As we roll through, let's mention Cherim. He allowed each of your grass and fire Pokemon to do 10 more damage, which was really good for cards like the Jumpluff from Heart Gold Soul Silver, and saw a little bit of play in that. It was pretty good. Anytime you can add damage, it's always a good in the Pokemon Trading Card Game. And the last one we're going to mention at number 10 is Bronzong. Now, the Bronzong from Stormfront, he had a fun little ability which allowed you to put a card on top of your deck and then search your deck for 2 basic energy cards. It was a way to make sure that you were constantly having energy in your hand. It was useful for decks just to make sure you had that energy. It also had Strange Spin for 2 energy, where you could do 60 damage plus confusion, but really this ability, it didn't see a huge amount of play. None of these Pokemon saw a huge amount of play. Dusknoir and Magnezone probably more than the others. What I'm pointing out here is, we're 8 minutes into the video, we're still on number 10, this is how good Stormfront was, and I'm lumping together all of these viable, playable Pokemon in at number 10, because otherwise we're not going to have time. In at number 9, let's do another little category. Let's talk about some EXs. I say EXs, that's a lie, I mean level Xs. Now, for those of you that don't remember, level Xs essentially were an extra evolution. So what you would do, you could only do this when they'd been down for a turn, and you could only level them up if they were in the active. And then you would have all the attacks, abilities, etc., Pokeballs and Pokepowers from the regular Pokemon, and any attacks or abilities from the level X. So you would have a whole host of stuff you could use. It was a fun little mechanic, and it was quite balanced because they had to be in the active, but they didn't give up extra prizes like something like an EX would nowadays. So let's run through a few of these. We had Machamp level X. He had a fun little ability, Pokebody. As long as he's your active, each of his attacks do 60 more damage, and any damage done to Machamp is increased by 60. You do 60 more, they do 60 more. Obviously, there was a little bit of skill in when to play this, but you could level up and then do 60 more damage, and you don't give up an extra prize for doing so. It's also got a fun little attack, Strong-Willed. Fighting double colourless is quite expensive. This was a very low energy format where a lot of Pokemon were attacking for 1 energy, hence why Dusknoir's ability was quite fun. But during your next turn, if Machamp would be knocked out, flip a coin. If heads, it would not be knocked out. Its HP becomes 10 instead. Now, it only does 20 damage, but of course, remember that no guard means that it actually does 80 damage. So you get your Pokemon or your opponent's Pokemon within 80, or just kill something like an Uxie or a Claydol that has 80 or less HP, and then your opponent only has a 50-50 chance of KOing you, and that is if they actually do enough damage to KO. It was kind of fun, ladies and gentlemen. We also had Raichu Level X, and Raichu Level X had a fun little Pokebody. When you evolved him, so this was a one-shot deal, you could use Voltage Shoot, and then you could use another attack straight afterwards. So Voltage Shoot, discard 2 lightning energy from your hand, kind of awkward because you had to have 3 energy on Raichu and 2 in your hand. Choose one of your opponent's Pokemon, do 80 damage. And I keep talking Uxie and Claydol, they were sitting ducks on the bench. And this did very briefly. We had a weird situation where a few Pokemon, and Raichu was one of these, actually had a Prime and a Level X in the format at the same time. Like I've said, this didn't happen for many Pokemon, and it didn't happen for very long, but there was a short period of time. So people would use Raichu Prime from Undaunted, and then they would Level X it. So you had Raichu Prime's Voltage increase Poké Power, move a Lightning Energy from one of your Pokemon to Raichu, and then you could use the Level X's attack, and then you could use Mega Thunderbolt on Raichu to do 120 damage. Now, that would mean discarding 2 energy from your hand and then discarding the 3 energy attached to Raichu, but you could take 2 prizes while doing so, and it was a fun little combo that a few people tried out. Raichu Level X was kind of fun, and if nothing else, it's a fun historical footnote that Raichu was one of the few Pokemon that had a Level X and a Prime that existed in the same format, so you can actually go ahead and use them with each other. And the last Level X I want to mention here at number 9 is Dusknoir. Now, he was a very complicated Pokemon. He only had a Poké Power. And essentially what it did was this. If he would be knocked out by damage, i.e. if he's going to be knocked out by poison, etc., this doesn't work. If he's going to be knocked out by damage, you discard all cards that were attached to him, all the energy, etc., and instead of discarding it, you put him into play as a stadium. Now, this does count as being knocked out. Your opponent does take a prize. But you put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's Pokemon between turns. How cool is that? And if he gets discarded, or if he gets taken out of play, he actually goes back to your hand rather than to the discard as a regular stadium would. And this did see a fair amount of play. You put him in, your opponent KOs him, he goes down as a stadium, and he does 10 damage between turns, i.e. after your turn and after your opponent's, 10 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. That, or 1 damage counter actually, so it would go through anything that protects the bench. That was really quite fun. It was a fun little card that saw a fair bit of play. So we've just had a whole bunch of fun little Pokemon at number 10. We've had 3 fun EXs, all of which saw a little bit of play at number 9. You should be getting excited. Now, in at number 8, we've got a pair of cards. And this is the last time in this video we'll be grouping cards together. It is one at a time from now on. Actually, that's a lie. But you'll see when we get there, it makes sense. Warp Energy and Cyclone Energy. A lovely little pair of energies. Special energies that counted as just a colourless energy, but did something else. Now, we don't have any of these anymore. But we had a whole bunch of these, the best of which, of course, was Cool Energy. But Warp and Cyclone, they were kind of two sides of the same coin. Cyclone Energy, when you attached it, you got your opponent to switch their active Pokemon. Oh, it was when you attached to your active. And Warp Energy was when you attached it, you switched your active. So if you started with something like a Baltoy, for instance, or you were playing Gyarados and you didn't want to be starting with a Magikarp, or you did want to be starting, or whatever, you could just use your Warp Energy to grab out of the active. So, a fun little pair. Cyclone Energy would be used. Now, your opponent chose the Pokemon to go active. It wasn't like something like a Lysander or a Pokemon Catcher. That would be ridiculous. But Cyclone Energy was really, really good if your opponent had a Pokemon in the active that you didn't want there. So, later on, something like Spiritomb that blocked trainers in the active would be something you could get rid of using Cyclone Energy. Or if you just, your opponent had a Pokemon you couldn't KO in the active, but a nice weak Pokemon you could KO on the bench, you would use Cyclone Energy. Think of it like a one-sided warp point. The other one is, of course, Warp Energy, which is the other side of Warp Point. It acts as a switch and it acts as an energy attachment all in one. They were very fun little special energy cards that saw a fair bit of play. Now, in at number 7, a personal favourite of mine, and a card that I am quite embarrassed to say I never actually played in a proper tournament, and it's one of my big regrets in the Pokemon Trading Card Game. Maybe I should be a grown man about this, not have regrets about the Pokemon Trading Card Game. Well, I'm not, and I do. And I regret not playing this. Now, part of the reason I never played this was because when I started playing the game, I was using Donphan, and Donphan, as a Donphan player, I loved playing against Regigigas Level X. It made me very, very happy. So, why does Regigigas Level X go in at number 7 when Machamp, Raichu and Dusknoir all got leveled in at number 9? Well, he has the Pokepower Sacrifice. Once during your turn, you may choose one of your Pokemon in play and that Pokemon is knocked out. And because it's knocked out, your opponent takes a prize. You're giving your opponent a prize. Why would you do this? You then search your discard pile for up to 2 basic energy cards, attach them to Regigigas, and remove 8 damage counters from Regigigas. This power can't be used if Regigigas is affected by a special condition. Okay. And it's got the attack Giga Blaster. 100 damage, discard the top card of your opponent's deck, and choose one card from your opponent's hand without looking and discard it. So you're doing 100 damage and discarding a card from their deck and discarding a card from their hand, and even though you have to give up a prize to do so, you get to attach basic energy cards from your discard pile and heal. And look at a whole bunch of, look at the Pokemon we've already looked at and pay attention to the Pokemon we are going to be looking at in the future. And I made this point in my Heart Gold Soul Silver history lesson and my Heart Gold Soul Silver Unleashed history lesson. Pokemon back then did not do as much damage. 150 HP was phenomenal, ladies and gentlemen. It was huge. And doing 100 damage was fantastic. You could even put an expert belt on Regigigas. Not in this set, of course. You had to wait a couple of sets. You had to wait until Arceus came out. But when it did, you could put an expert belt. And then you had a 170 HP Regigigas who could heal 80 damage and do 120. He was, quite frankly, utterly ridiculous. He was really, really, really good. And he saw a lot of play, and he saw a fair amount of success in tournaments. This was a Pokemon, this was a deck by itself. Decks would be built around this, and these decks won tournaments. But one little footnote I should give you here is that the Regigigas that was largely played with this was actually a promo Regigigas, not one from an actual set. So it was a Diamond and Pearl promo 40, and what it did was 30 damage for free energy, But you got to choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and switch it with the active before doing damage. Now, firstly, this could KO very weak Pokemon. It could KO those baby Pokemon when they came in Heart Gold, Soul Silver. But it would also allow you to strand Pokemon in the active while you got Regigigas set up. Also, 80 damage for 4 energies, very useful of course, because you couldn't use Giga Blaster turn after turn, so you would use the promo there to do 80 damage where you couldn't. Regigigas Level X, which was also re-released as a promo in a tin, which was kind of cool. And am I the only one here that thinks it looks a lot like Regigigas is acting as some kind of DJ spinning some records? I cannot be the only one that thinks that. So, Regigigas, personal favourite of mine, gets in at number 7. In at number 6, a far less exciting card. I wish I had a more exciting card for you at number 6. I don't, but it's a darn good card. It's Luxury Ball. And Luxury Ball, search your deck for a Pokemon, put it in your hand. Now, you couldn't get a level X, but you could get any other Pokemon. Now, if Luxury Ball was in your discard pile, you couldn't play it, so although you could play more than one in your deck, you could only use the first one. Let me make this simple for anyone that wasn't playing at the time. You played one Luxury Ball in your deck. Everybody played one Luxury Ball in every single deck. Reason was, if you think about all the cards, you think about what we've got nowadays, you've got your Ultra Ball, discard 2 cards and search for any Pokemon. And that's about the best draw we have. Or Level Ball. You can search for any Pokemon that has 90 HP or less. There's very little good search. Now, Master Ball was reprinted as an ace spec. You could only have one in your deck, which had a very similar thing to Luxury Ball in that it let you search for anything. Universal Pokemon Search is not often found in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, and Luxury Ball was so gosh darn good, it has to be in at number 6. Now, in at number 5, we have some cards which are fairly unusual, or at least they were far more unusual until recently. These are cards, well, recently we had Puzzle of Time released, and this is a card which has 2 different effects depending how you use it. If you use it as a one-of, it's not particularly good. You just get to rearrange the top 3 cards of your deck. But if you use 2 at once, then you get to search your deck for any 2 cards in a discard pile. That's really, really good. Now, in Stormfront, we actually had a bunch of these kind of cards coming out, 2 of which were very, very good indeed. Now, we did have Poker Healer Plus, which was not particularly good. It was not a card that we saw a huge amount of play. People didn't really tend to like it very much. But again, it was different depending whether you played 1 or 2. If you played 1, you got to remove 1 damage counter and a special condition. Useful, of course, if your Pokemon is suffering from paralysis or poison. But if you played 2, you got to remove 8 damage counters and all special conditions. So if you use 2, it's far, far better. We also had Poker Blower Plus, which was one of the 2 that saw a fair amount of play. If you play 1, flip a coin, if heads, 1 damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon. It's fine, it's not great, it is very much just okay. But if you play 2 at the same time, it has the same effect as Lysander or Pokemon Catcher before it got errated and needed a coin flip. You get to bring one of your opponent's Pokemon into the active position. This has always been a very, very powerful effect in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, and for that reason, it did see play in a whole bunch of decks. It was one of those cards that people quite liked to use. Now, my personal favourite of the ones, and I played this in my Donphan deck, it was very good for consistency, Poker Draw Plus. Now, this was a card, again, if you played 1, it was okay. Playing 1 allowed you to draw a card. That's fine, it lets you mill through your deck a little faster. But if you play 2, you get to search for 2 cards and put them into your hand. Think of it like a computer search, but you get to grab 2 cards instead of 1, and you don't have to discard. Or a Twins, but you don't have to be behind in the game. Or a Teammates. You see where I'm going with this, ladies and gentlemen. It's an incredibly powerful attack, and it was a superbly good card. And if you could play it, I mean, with things like Uxie and Claydol, you really could draw into 2 of these far better. We lived in a format where drawing into 2 of these at the same time was far easier than it is nowadays, and it was really, really good. So now we're getting into the top 4, and if you saw a quick improvement in audio quality in the last couple of minutes, I made a quick change, so if it's been a little bit not bad, but not as good as it could have been up till now, it should be fixed. But I've already edited the first 20 minutes, so I'm afraid you'll have to live with it. And you've already watched it anyway, so I'm sorry. Now, the top 4, this is where it really gets serious, ladies and gentlemen. This is where we see 4 Pokemon, and to be honest, I've got my order here. Now, to be honest, I'm just thinking here, you could switch around Luxury Ball and Pokedraw and Pokeblower Plus. But the top 4 here, they are clearly the top 4. They are head and shoulders above the rest of the cards in this set. You can run around the order if you want, but at number 4, I've got Gyarados. And Gyarados was a weird kind of card. It was one of those cards that everyone looked at initially and went, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then a French chap went and got top 8 at the World Championships with it. And then all of a sudden, it became really, really good. And this was a deck you could actually play with 0 energy. So what you would do is you would use the attack Tail Revenge. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, this was used for Tail Revenge. It is a free attack, that's what that whole means. 30 damage times the number of Magikarp in your discard pile. Now you need 1 Magikarp under Gyarados, so you have the other 3 in the discard pile, and you're doing 90 damage for 0 energy on a stage 1. Remember, we've got Broken Time Space to allow you to just go Magikarp Gyarados straight away. There were cards that allowed you to grab him, the Magikarp, out to the discard, and we had supporter cards like Felicity's Drawing, to give you an example, that came out in Great Encounters, which allowed you to discard 2 cards from your hand and then draw 3 or 4 cards, depending how many you discarded, which was really good if you were to do something like discarding a couple of Magikarp from your hand, for instance. So you try and search them out with your draw cards, then you would try and use Felicity's Drawing to get rid of them. It was really, really good, ladies and gentlemen. It was a fantastically good card. And Gyarados, I keep telling you that in this format, Gyarados is a powerhouse Pokemon. He's got 130. So you would use cards like Gyarados. You would put an Expert Bout onto who's hitting for 110. And then we had cards like Plus Power, which would allow you to do a whole bunch more damage. Or later on, you could use Crobat G to do some extra damage. And let's not forget that when you're playing a card, or a deck I should say, which revolves around a 4/4 line of your attacker and 0 energy, in a format where you can draw very well, you can really start to play around with stuff like Plus Power and Crobat G, which you would reuse with Poketurn, and it really was a deck which was very, very good. It was one of those cards that everybody looked at and went, it's alright, seems fine. And then French chap went to Worlds and made top 8. Everyone started taking it seriously, and it became an archetype. At number 3, ironically a card that was very, very important in this Gyarados deck, we had Sableye. And he was very, very good indeed. He actually had a whole bunch of uses. He had a Pokebody, which allowed you to guarantee that you would be able to go first. If you started him as your active Pokemon, you go first. And then, of course, we have 2 attacks, both of which are very, very good. Now, the second one is a less impressive one. This does for a single Dark Energy, 10 damage, but if the Pokemon has fewer remaining HP than Sableye, then it does 40. And you've got cards like Plus Power, etc. that you can use. You can even put an Expert Bout so that Sableye has 80 HP and actually goes ahead and does 60 damage, as an example. And this was really, really good for getting what we call a donk. That is where you KO your opponent's only Pokemon before they've even drawn a card. And you could attack going first in this format. So you go Sableye against your opponent's Magikarp, 1 energy, you KO it. If you go first against your opponent's Cleffa, which we know a few sets later became big, you KO it straight away, and so on and so forth. You could fairly reliably KO 60 HP basics in a deck that played Sableye, Dark Energy, and Expert Bout. Cards like Machop, for instance, 60 HP, they would go down. But it was this Impersonate that we really, really liked. Again, it's an attack which you do for 0 energy, search for a supporter, discard it, shuffle your deck. use the effect of that card as the effect of this attack. And there were so many options I can't go into them, but here's a few. You can use Felicity's Drawing, like I've just said. After we had the Heart Gold Soul Silver set, you use a Pokemon Collector, and let's say that you grab 2 Magikarp and a Regice. Now, Regice was a popular tech, and I use this in my Donphan deck as well, whereby you discard 2 cards from your hand and you force your opponent to switch their active. Why was this so useful? Well, you could discard those 2 Magikarp that you just searched out with Pokemon Collector. And if your opponent used something like a Spiritomb, they leave Spiritomb in the active, so you use Regice to make your opponent switch. Spiritomb is no longer in the active, and Spiritomb blocks trainers, but only when he's in the active. One other use I'll give you for Sableye Impersonate is that you could use this if you were playing... I mentioned it in a previous video. You could play a Sable Lock deck where you would use something like a Cyrus's Conspiracy, and you would use this to try and get your opponent down to very few cards. Or indeed, you could use a something like a Judge, and by Conspiracy I of course mean Cyrus's Initiative. I put the right card up. I got it wrong the first time, but it switched around now. You could use something like a Judge to put your opponent down to 4 cards, and then heck, the next turn you could go ahead and use Cyrus's Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a very good card that had a lot of uses, and it's still... Now, we've seen how good Sableye and Gyarados are. They don't get into the top 2. Now, in terms of the top 2, I think they're in the top 2. I think they're better than Sableye and Gyarados. I would not be particularly upset if you argued these the other way round, but I am firmly of the belief that at number 2, we've got Gengar, another Pokemon that had a Poké Power and 2 attacks, all of which were brilliant. First of all, Fainting Spell. And this is one of my least favourite things in the trading card game ever. I intensely dislike Fainting Spell. If Gengar would be knocked out by damage from an attack, flip a coin if heads a defending Pokemon is knocked out. Imagine if you get a Donphan, and you get free energy on a Donphan, and you put an Expert Bout on Donphan. So you get to do 110 damage with a free energy Pokemon, and you get a KO on 110 HP Gengar. You're feeling really good about yourself, things are going well, you're thinking like you're gonna, oh wait, your opponent flipped heads, you're knocked out as well. Except because you had an Expert Belt, your opponent takes 2 prizes, you only take 1. I despised Fainting Spell. Now, there were ways around it, of course. If you knocked out Gengar from poison, then it doesn't go in. The most common way to do this would be to actually KO Gengar with Uxie's attack. Now, we've talked about Uxie a lot as a Pokemon that helped you to set up, but what Uxie's attack did is that it made you put Uxie onto the bottom of your deck. Therefore, he was no longer in the active, therefore he was gone before Fainting Spell could kick in. But this means that you had to play around it, and this is one of the things that made Gengar so good. But we have since had a Chandelure printed which has Fainting Spell, and this has seen very, 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 very little play. So he must have had some good attacks, and oh my goodness, he did. Firstly, Shadow Room. 3 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. If it's got any Poké Powers, 6 damage counters instead. Uxie, Claydol, you see where we're going with this. It was very, very good. But he also had Poltergeist for just a Psychic and a Colorless, and again, another example of really low energy Pokemon attacks. 30 damage times the number of trainer, supporter, and stadium cards in your opponent's hand. Trainers are what we used to call items. Nowadays, we've got trainer item, trainer stadium, etc. Trainers are what we call items, and then we've got supporters and stadiums, i.e. all trainer cards as they would be nowadays. Now, that's really, really good, but of course your opponent would just play all their trainers. So you would play Gengar along with Vileplume. And for a long time, this was actually used as Vilegar. And what you would do is you would start with a Spiritomb in the active. When we get to Arceus, clearly Spiritomb's going to be very high on that list. You have a Spiritomb in the active. Spiritomb blocks trainers and helps you to get your Vileplume out. You get Vileplume out, nobody can play any trainers, and then Gengar sits there using Poltergeist. When your opponent finally KOs Gengar, well, that's okay, because you can go ahead and hopefully, if you flip a heads, then you actually get a KO on them as well. It's not fair, ladies and gentlemen, and that's one of the reasons it was such a good deck. As a little side note, even the Ghastly from this set was pretty good. For the 0 energy, you could do Pitch Dark, meaning that your opponent cannot play any trainer cards. Now, this was just items. It didn't include supporters and stadiums as they now would be, but that's pretty good. Now, given that we've seen cards like Luxury Ball, Gengar, Sableye, and Gyarados, none of whom could break into the top slot, the card which has made it into number 1 must be really, really good. And if you've been paying attention by now, you've probably guessed who it is. It's Machamp. And if you want to disagree and put Gyarados or Gengar in the probably Gyarados, but if you want to put Gengar in the top slot, I ain't going to hate you for it, ladies and gentlemen. But Machamp really, really impacted the format. Now, to be fair, Hurricane Punch, doing 30 damage times the amount of heads you can flip from 4 coins, pretty gosh darn good. Rage was also quite useful, although expensive, but it's takeout. 40 damage, except that's not really what it did, because if it's a basic Pokemon, or not an evolved Pokemon, the Pokemon is knocked out instead of being damaged by the attack. Just a straight knockout, single energy, and I need to remind you, you could in one turn go Machop, Rare Candy, Machamp. If you went first, you could get Machamp going and use Takeout, and donks with Machamp were very, very common. One of my most frustrating games I ever played was against my good friend Tommy Roberts' lovely mother Liz. I was playing Donphan, she was playing Machamp. Game 1, we had quite a long game, but Donphan beat Machamp, so I'm sitting there doing quite nicely. I win a long game 1, I'm feeling good. Game 2, she goes first, gets a Machamp, uses Takeout, donks my lone basic, we go to game 3. But I'm going first in game 3. And I managed to get 2 Pokemon down, and on turn 1, she uses Machamp, she plays a Seeker to make me pick up my other bench Pokemon, and then uses Takeout. She donked me 2 games in a row, and I lost the series despite having a deck which in a longer game would win. That's what Machamp did. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. If he was just a one-trick pony, just a donk machine as it were, that wouldn't be so impressive, but he wasn't. Oh no. Remember I mentioned Regigigas? He came in at number 8 on this list. Well, he's an unevolved Pokemon. So Regigigas comes against Machamp, you lose. I mentioned about Sableye, he gets knocked out by Machamp. I mentioned these SP Pokemon, Luxray, Garchomp, and there are many others. These XP Pokemon, as we're going to mention in future videos and look forward to them, they are going to be seen as these great Pokemon, because they were amazing. And Machamp one-hit KO'd all of them. Machamp was so ridiculously good that Pokemon players would have to tech against it. So we had cards like Unknown G, which you had to play in every single SP deck. And what Unknown G did was it allowed you to attach him as a tool to one of your Pokemon, and it prevented all effects of attacks, so that Takeout couldn't actually KO these unevolved Pokemon in one go. People would play cards like Uxie Level X, because Machamp had a weakness to Psychic, so people would play Uxie Level X to try and use Zen Blade to get a KO on this Machamp. It was ludicrous, except Uxie didn't actually get a KO on Machamp, because back then, weakness was plus 30, it wasn't times 2. So people would have to use Lucario GL, whose Pokebody made all weaknesses times 2, and then they would have to use a Crobat to do 10 damage so that they could use Uxie Level X to do 60 damage, which times by 2 with Lucario. That's what it took for SP players to beat Machamp. One of the great things for me was they were so busy teching against Machamp, they didn't tech against Donphan, which meant that I had a very nice SP matchup. But this is not about my Donphan deck. It's about how gosh darn good Machamp was. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially what you need to know about Stormfront. This is by far my longest history of the Pokemon Trading Card Game video. It is by far the most requested set, and to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, there's a darn good reason for it. It was a phenomenal set. When cards like Luxury Ball, Regigigas Level X, Machamp Level X, Magnezone, Dust Noir don't even crack the top 5, and some arguably not even the top 10, and you've got cards like Machamp, Gengar, Sableye, and Gyarados, and all of those cards could have been the best card in a number of other sets. It was phenomenal. As always, ladies and gentlemen, there is a comment section. If you disagree with anything I've said, get it down there in the comments. And if you've got a set you would like me to have a look at, chuck it down there in the comments. That would be very nice indeed. And of course, click that like button. Have you clicked it yet? Bit mean if you haven't. And as always, make sure you subscribe, and if you haven't, and if you've already subscribed, make sure you get a friend to subscribe on your behalf. And most importantly, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.